You know, sometimes a game looks like a shooter on the outside, but when you actually sit down and pay attention, you realize it's basically a philosophy textbook wearing space armor. I introduce you to Destiny. Destiny isn't just pew pew aliens, it's a mythological universe about cosmic religion, political collapse, authoritarian resurrection, colonial trauma, holy wars, and the survival of humanity under a godlike orb that may or may not love us back. What is Destiny actually all about? Well, beneath the loot cycle, beneath the raid mechanics, beneath the exotic drops we keep getting duplicates of, there is a surprisingly academic and deeply rich theology. Destiny has become one of the most interesting explorations of religion and politics in modern gaming, and today we're diving into why. Let's talk about the politics of humanity's last city, the religion of the light, the fanatical holy war of the hive, and the cosmic nihilism of the darkness. Destiny is not just a sci-fi shooter, Destiny is a cosmic religion simulator.
We called it the Traveler, and its arrival changed us forever.
When I call the Traveler a sacred center, that's straight from Mircea Eliade's foundational work, The Sacred and the Profane. Eliade argues that every religion defines a hierophany, a point where divine erupts into the world, creating order out of chaos. In Destiny, the Traveler is the hierophany, the Tower is the Axis Mundi, and the Last City is the sacred territory protected by divine presence. Eliade also says that sacred spaces organize reality around them. That is literally how the city politically functions. The Traveler's silence aligns with Rudolf Otto's classic concept of the Mysterium Tremendum, an awe-inspiring, unknowable divine presence that resists interpretation. Otto argues that the unknown generates myth, ritual, priesthood, fanaticism, and projection. That would explain why Ikora, Zavala, the Speaker, the Elixni, and the Hive all build different theologies around the same silent god. Destiny mirrors real-world apophatic theology, seen in early Christian mysticism, Sufism, and Kabbalah. A god who does not speak becomes a god who means anything to anyone. What makes the Traveler especially compelling from a religious studies perspective is that its silence doesn't simply allow interpretation, it requires it. The absence of scripture, doctrine, or divine speech forces humanity to engage in what theologian Paul Tillich calls the ultimate concern, the process by which communities project their deepest existential anxieties onto the divine. Tillich wrote that when a god does not speak, the community fills the void with stories, symbols, and rituals that reflect their fears and hopes more than the nature of the deity itself. Destiny reflects this perfectly. The speaker's entire authority flows from this absence. He becomes the mediator between the inevitable and the everyday, not because the Traveler chose him, but because the Traveler's silence makes such a role necessary. In Destiny, belief is the connective tissue between humanity and its god, not revelation. This makes the Traveler less like a Judeo-Christian deity and more like the miraculous relics or numinous objects of ancient civilizations, where the divine is inferred through impact rather than proclamation. Even more interesting is how the Traveler creates a form of civilizational memory. Sociologist Emil Durkheim argues that societies create the sacred as a way of forming collective identity. The Traveler becomes the last city's shared origin myth, a narrative through which humanity rebuilds itself. The fact that it can be wounded, broken, dormant, or imprisoned allows it to function like the gods of ancient mythologies, unpredictable, cyclical, sometimes benevolent, sometimes destructive. Its vulnerabilities give it character without giving it voice. Destiny's world building succeeds because the Traveler operates the way real gods operate in human societies, through mystery, absence, symbolism, and the narratives communities construct around them. The reveal that the Traveler has touched every corner of Destiny's universe reframes its role not simply as a guardian deity, but as a cosmic architect of sacred spaces. Its presence is not symbolic, it's generative. Whenever it travels, it leaves behind not monuments, but civilizations. It becomes impossible then to understand any culture in Destiny separate from the divine ecology the Traveler establishes. In religious studies terms, the Traveler is less like the Abrahamic god and more akin to the wandering demiurge, a world shaper whose interventions create not commandments, but ecosystems, technologies, and mythologies that define entire species. The final shape confirms what the lore has been whispering for years. The Traveler gave rise to the Witnesses species as well. Long before it came to humanity, before it uplifted the Elixni, before its shadows stretched over Fundament, the Traveler seeded life and possibility across countless worlds. The Witness and its people were once beneficiaries of the same sacred intervention. This transforms the traveler from a god of humanity into a god of cosmic ancestry. In Eladi's sense, this recasts the traveler as the ultimate hierophany, a divine eruption that creates not just holy space, but holy lineage. This revelation also casts a new light on the Hive's ancient warning. The syzygy, the Great Wave, was as prophesied to destroy Fundament. That warning, encoded in the worm gods' lies, was originally the traveler attempting to save the Proto-Hive from extinction. The syzygy was not a punishment, it was not the traveler abandoning the planet, it was the traveler doing what it always does, protecting life by urging it to evolve, escape, or adapt. In this version of the story, the traveler becomes less a fleeing god and more a cosmic shepherd, desperately trying to guide another species towards survival. But the worms, acting as agents of the witness's manipulation, twisted that warning into a betrayal narrative. The Hive never realized that the traveler had been trying to save them, not abandon them. The Elixni too have built entire mythologies around the traveler's departure. Their history is soaked in loss, famine, and religious trauma. Their whirlwind was not caused by the traveler, but its departure became the cultural wound through which their modern identity was forged. In sociological terms, the traveler leaving became a foundational myth of absence, the kind that shapes diasporas for generations. Yet this too is part of the traveler's cosmic pattern. It uplifts, it creates, it empowers, and then it leaves. Not out of malice, but because its work is rooted in cycles of renewal, not permanence. If the traveler is a gardener, then no garden is meant to be tended forever. Even more fascinating are the cradles, the terraforming structures that the traveler leaves behind like divine fingerprints scattered across the cosmos. These cradles are not merely atmospheric machines, they are sacred architectures, sites where the boundary between the mundane and the miraculous collapses. They reshape landscapes, purify air, alter ecosystems, and infuse planets with a kind of metaphysical fertility. In academic terms, they are the Axis Mundi machines, technologies that anchor a world into the traveler's sacred order. They turn planets into temples, they inscribe divinity directly into geology. The effect is cultural as much as it is ecological. Every species touched by the traveler begins to structure its theology around these transformed worlds. The Elixni revered their cradle as a holy relic. Humanity built its golden age around the traveler's gifts. Even the witness's people, long forgotten, developed philosophies informed by the abundance the traveler bestowed. The traveler's terraforming becomes the blueprint for their ethics, their science, their art, and eventually their downfall. In this sense, the traveler is not just a god of light, but a god of beginnings. Its interventions are never purely benevolent nor entirely orchestrated. They resemble what historian Karen Armstrong calls the creative myth-making, the idea that divine encounters don't prescribe meaning, but inspire societies to create meaning in response. Every civilization the traveler touches must decide what a gift means. For some, it becomes a blessing, for others, a burden. For still others, a wound that never heals. The traveler's sacred spaces are thus not singular places, like the Tower or the Last City. They are planetary scale sanctuaries, ecosystems molded by the presence of a divine force that reshapes matter and culture alike. And the fact that the traveler has shaped the witness's origins, the Hive's warnings, the Elixni's exile, and humanity's second renaissance ties every narrative thread and destiny to the same divine root, a cosmic heritage shared by a friend and an enemy alike. The traveler is the common ancestor they never knew they had.
Welcome to the last safe city on Earth. The only place the traveler can still protect. It took centuries to build. Now, we're counting every day it stands. And this tower is where the Guardians live.
Max Weber, arguably the father of modern sociology, classified political legitimacy into 1. Traditional authority, 2. Charismatic authority, and 3. Legal rational authority. The Last City blends all three. The traditional is the speaker as a religious figure, charismatic is the Guardians as mythic heroes, and the legal rational is the vanguard command structure. Destiny's political system is extremely close to Weber's idea of a theocratic military oligarchy, power concentrated in a religious elite and enforced by a military class. It also mirrors the state of exception described by political theorist Giorgio Agamben, a state that exists in permanent crisis, suspends normal political structures, elevates military authority, and normalizes emergency powers. The Last City never leaves a state of exception because existential threats never end. The Guardian class fits into Weber's concept of charismatic authority, the leaders whose legitimacy comes from supernatural gifts rather than elections, law, or inheritance. Destiny reinforces this with what Michel Foucault calls biopower, the power to regulate life and death. Guardians quite literally determine who lives, they control who dies, can resurrect themselves, and cannot be punished by ordinary citizens. I'm recording this a few weeks later because I was playing Destiny Renegades, but I thought it was completely hilarious and coincidental that Dredge and Ball, the villain of Destiny Renegades, is actually completely against this exact same thing I'm talking about. I recorded all the following a couple weeks ago and I thought it was hilarious when playing the expansion. So please take into a look as to what I'm about to say as the exact same reasons why Dredge and Ball hates us and why he's one of Destiny's best villains of the contemporary time. Alright, let's get back into it. 3, 2, 1, let's go. Guardians quite literally have a monopoly on life itself. They determine the lives of everyone around them and the lives of everybody who are to come. This makes the Last City a state where power is not political, but ontological. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Last City is how heavily it relies on what political theorist Benedict Anderson calls the imagined communities. Anderson argued that nations are not defined by borders or constitutions, but by shared stories that allow people who will never meet to imagine themselves as a part of the collective. The Last City doesn't have elections, a parliament, or formal citizenship. What it has is a story of humanity's last refuge as a myth under unity under the Traveler's shadow. That myth is powerful enough to bind together survivors from dozens of lost nations, cultures, and languages. And yet, the political fragility of the city is always palpable. The citizen population depends entirely on the warrior caste that lives separately, thinks separately, and operates on a different metaphysical plane. For all intents and purposes, Guardians don't age, they don't vote, and they don't die. They don't share the vulnerabilities of the people that they protect. This creates a political paradox similar to what the ancient Romans faced with its Praetorian Guard, an elite military group whose power dwarfs that of the civilians and whose loyalty is assumed rather than guaranteed. We also see hints of Foucault's concept of governmentality, the way modern states guide citizens through force, but through habit, belief, and subtle systems of discipline. The Last City doesn't coerce its inhabitants, it doesn't need to. The existential threat outside the walls makes obedience feel like a common sense. It's what a Gabin would call voluntary submission under permanent emergency. People follow vanguard decisions because the alternative is annihilation. Destiny never states this outright, but structurally the Last City resembles a medieval polity, a divine figure in the Traveler, a priestly interpreter in the Speaker, a martial aristocracy in the Guardians, and a civilian base whose political agency is replaced by faith in holy protectors. It's society based and built on hope that those with power remain benevolent. The Last City's political structure, this uneasy blend of military leadership, religious legitimacy, and communal myth works only so long as the vanguard maintain both symbolic and practical authority. It is a system built on faith in institutions rather than institutions themselves, but Destiny repeatedly shows us that what happens when those institutions wobble, the entire structure becomes brittle. This fragility becomes painfully obvious during the Endless Night, when the system experiences a constitutional crisis without ever having a constitution. Lakshmi II's betrayal is the most explicit political rupture the city has ever faced, and arguably the most telling. For years, the Future War cult positioned itself as a fringe organization, a sect that blended militaristic paranoia with pseudoscientific prophecy. Their belief in deterministic futures, a worldview rooted in a blend of mysticism and vexed temporal mathematics, has always made them outsiders. In more stable societies, groups like the FWC becomes countercultures. In fragile societies, they become insurgents. The Endless Night provided the perfect condition for the shift: fear, uncertainty, public mistrust, and a sense that the vanguard had lost its grips on events. Lakshmi capitalizes on this moment the way populist leaders throughout history have done, by promising clarity in a chaotic world. Her rhetoric follows what political theorist Hannah Arendt describes as a central move for authoritarian movements: the transformation of uncertainty into inevitability. She doesn't argue that the Elixir might betray the city, she insists that they will, because her, quote, visions confirm it. But what makes her coup so tragic and so politically rich is that her visions were nothing more than Vex influence masquerading as a prophecy. She became a mouthpiece for not the divine foresight, but for the machine consciousness exploiting a political vacuum. This moment reveals a deeper truth about the Last City. Its governance relies not on a robust political apparatus, but on the perceived sanctity of the Vanguard. Once that sanctity cracks, all the unresolved contradictions of the Last City burst into view. The civilians who have no formal representation or voice in governance become susceptible to fear-mongering. Factions like the Future War Cult, New Monarchy, and Dead Orbit begin to operate like proto-political parties without accountability or restraint. What had been a loosely unified refugee population becomes a fragmented pseudo-state, each faction claiming its own vision for survival. Lakshmi 2's coup attempt mirrors real-world scenarios where technologically empowered elites override democratic processes through a combination of ideology and perceived inevitability. And her manipulation by the Vex adds an even darker layer. If political legitimacy in the Last City relies on prophetic authority, whether the speaker's interpretations or Lakshmi's visions, then political collapse becomes not just possible, but inevitable whenever that prophetic authority is hijacked. It's the Achilles heel for any theocratic system. If your god stops speaking, anyone can claim to have heard its voice. Lakshmi's final broadcast is chilling precisely because it blends religious certainty, political rhetoric, and technological influence. She does not see herself as a traitor. She sees herself as a savior, as the only leader willing to act on quote-unquote truth. But that self-perception is exactly what makes her dangerous. She embodies what Max Weber called the dark side of charismatic authority. The moment when leaders are so convinced of their own righteousness that they become immune to evidence, persuasion, or accountability. Her death does not restore stability, it exposes the hollowness of the Vanguard's power. The system survives, but the myth of its infallibility does not. The city learns that the Vanguard cannot control every narrative, cannot prevent every coup, and cannot rely on faith alone to maintain cohesion. The political order holds, but only just, and if destiny teaches us anything, it's that society built on myth rather than structure can be shaken by a single voice claiming to have seen the future.
At least the stars will remember the shape I gave them.
Okay, so we've been talking about the politics here back on Earth, but let's get into the religion of one of the most fascinating people in all of gaming. Let's talk about the Hive. I dedicate this section to one of my best friends, Matt. He really loves the Hive and orcs and the sword logic and everything about it, so this one's for you, buddy. The sword logic reflects Nietzsche's will to power, Heraclitus' doctrine of strife, Spartan agoge, warrior upbringing, Aztec human sacrifice, and Frantz Fanon's view of decolonization through violence. Yes, that was butchered. No, we will not be correcting it. Nietzsche argued that life is the expression of power and that systems built on pity weaken societies. This is from Genealogy of Morals from 1887. The Hive take this to the extreme and basically say existence is justified through victorious struggle alone. Anthropologist René Girard wrote about sacred violence, the idea that communities maintain order through ritualized destruction. The Hive literally encodes sacred meaning into killing. The worm gods behave like the following. The Canaanite deities, Moloch and Baal, demanding sacrifice, the oracles of Delphi controlling politics through prophecy, or the colonial era civilizing gods offering truth in exchange for obedience. The Hive sword logic and faith is not simply just sci-fi, but it's based really in an academically coherent religious system rooted in real-world analogies. What makes the Hive's religion feel disturbingly believable is that it merges cosmic metaphysics with philosopher Walter Benjamin's called divine violence. Benjamin argued that some forms of violence exist outside legal or moral frameworks. They claim legitimacy not through justice, but through a kind of sacred inevitability. This is exactly how the Hive understand destruction. Violence is not simply permitted, it is woven into the fabric of the universe. To resist violence, in their worldview, is to resist reality itself. That is why the Hive fanatics die with religious fervor. They believe their annihilation only strengthens those who strike them down, fulfilling the logic of the universe. There is also a strong resonance with what historian Jan Osman calls cultural memory and counter-religion. The Hive originate from a civilization that was betrayed, manipulated, and broken. Their conversation to the sword logic is on some level a rejection of cosmology that failed them. They become a counter-religion, a belief system built in explicit opposition to the Traveler's philosophy. Rather than seeing the universe as a gift or trust, they see it as a battlefield and test, where the Traveler nurtures, the Hive devours. Because the sword logic governs not only morality, but physics within the Hive's worldview, their society becomes self-reinforcing. Acolytes, knights, wizards, each caste embodies a different sacralized function of its violent cosmology. Their architecture, their rituals, their chants all reflect what researchers like Clifford Geertz describe as religion as a cultural system, a totalizing worldview that shapes perception, identity, and action. The Hive are terrifying not just because they want to believe in violence, but because violence is the foundation of their meaning. What makes the Hive religion one of the most compelling mythologies in gaming is not simply its brutality, but its origins, a story that begins not with conquest, but with desperation, tragedy, and cosmic manipulation. The tale of Oryx, Savathun, and Xivu Arath is not merely a villain origin story, it is what religious scholar Mircea Eliade would call myth of beginnings, a cosmogonic narrative that explains the foundational trauma of a people. Before they were gods of war, deceit, and ascension, the siblings were simply survivors, children of a dying species on a doomed world. On Fundament, their civilization was trapped in what anthropologists might describe as structural helplessness, a social system designed to prevent mobility, advancement, or hope. Life was brutally short, power was hereditary, and the species was locked into a caste system that defined suffering as destiny. This structure resembled what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called symbolic violence, a system that contains the oppressed of internalize their oppression as natural. The siblings' early life takes place in a world where resistance is unimaginable, not because it is forbidden, but because the imagination to resist has been systematically erased. Oryx, then known as Arash, rejects that fatalism. Their journey to the depths of Fundament echoes the archetypal descent narratives found in ancient mythologies. Orpheus descending into the underworld, Inanna traveling to the land of the dead, Odin sacrificing himself to Yggdrasil. This descent marks the transition from mortal limitation to mythic power, but unlike those myths, Arash does not descend seeking salvation, they descend seeking truth, and the truth that they find is a lie wrapped in cosmic theater. The Worm Gods offer what appears to be divine revelation, but is this kind of revelation theologian Paul Tillich warned about? The false absolute, the idol mistaken for the ultimate. The worms claim that the universe is a place of eternal struggle, that only the sword is real, that only the victorious deserve existence. To a desperate people, this doctrine feels like empowerment. It gives meaning to suffering. It transforms fear into purpose. It reframes extinction as a moral test rather than tragedy. The siblings accept the pact not because they are cruel, but because they have been convinced that cruelty is the fabric of reality. But hidden behind this revelation lies a deeper manipulation, one orchestrated not by the Worm Gods, but by the Witness. The Book of Sorrows hint at this without ever reducing it to a simple exposition. The Worm Gods were not independent deities, but instruments, puppets performing the will of a being that had long ago decided the shape of the universe. This makes the Hive religion a double heresy. Not only is it founded on violence, but it is built on a cosmic lie. The Witness engineered the siblings' fall as the way colonizers historically engineered the destinies of oppressed people, offering narratives of empowerment that ultimately served imperial control. Savathun's later rebellion makes this dynamic even more intellectually rich. She represents what philosopher Michel de Chartreux called tactics of resistance, the ways the powerless reclaim agency within systems designed to dominate them. Her lies, deception, and betrayals are not arbitrary villainy, but a response to cosmic structure that weaponized truth against her. Her lies, deceptions, and betrayals are not arbitrary villainy, but a response to a cosmic structure that weaponized truth against her. In rejecting sword logic's absolute narrative, Savathun became the first Hive deity to question theology imposed by the Witness. Savathun's turn towards the light is not redemption in a moral sense, but emancipation in an existential sense. Xivu Arath, by contrast, becomes the purest expression of sword logic, a being who embodies Walter Benjamin's divine violence, violence enacted without justification or restraint, violence that claims legitimacy through its own enchantment. She is what Hive religion becomes when stripped of doubt, nuance, or introspection, a cosmic engine that transforms existence into war without end. And then there's everyone's favorite Taken King, Oryx. Oryx is the tragic center of the Hive mythology, a figure who discovers the truth of the worm gods and the witness, kills the worm god Akka to seize the power to confront it, and yet chooses to perpetuate the same system rather than dismantle it. This makes Oryx resemble the tragic heroes of Greek theater, individuals who see the truth clearly but lack the freedom or perhaps the courage to escape the binds of fate. His creation of the Taken, a parody of the free will which beings are purified through obligation or self, reflects that the philosophy Simon Well described as Malheur, a spiritual affliction that turns its victims into instruments of the very force that oppresses them. Oryx's death, Savathun's transformation, and Zivu-Rat's endless crusade together form a broken trinity. Each represents a different response to cosmic oppression: acceptance, rebellion, and fanaticism. The Hive religion is not simply a cult of violence, it's a cosmology shaped by betrayal, a theology built on manipulation, and an existential struggle against a god whose ultimate destruction reveals how hollow its promises always have been. What Destiny accomplished with the Hive is something rare in gaming. It builds a mythological system that feels ancient, tragic, and intellectually coherent. Their story is a religion as trauma, theology as survival, and metaphysics as the last refuge of a people abandoned by their gods.
We are not your friend. We are not your enemy. We are your salvation.
And now for something that we've all been looking forward to, the center discussion of all of this, the light versus the darkness. Destiny's light and dark dichotomy is not a binary good and evil. It resembles dualistic cosmologies such as Zoroastrianism in Asha versus Drush, Taoism in the yin and yang, Gnostic cosmology in the light entrapped in matter, and Machianism, two eternal principles. Light can be seen as preservation, order, and unity. This is seen in the echoes of Augustine's theology of divine order. Darkness is therefore seen as entropy, ego, and survival. This echoes Hobbes' state of nature. Destiny essentially asks us, is order inherently oppressive? Is freedom inherently destructive? This parallels political theorist Hannah Arendt, who argued that the total order, even well-meaning, becomes authoritarian. Meanwhile, the darkness aligns with Nietzsche's self-actualization and Camus' absurd hero, rejecting imposed meaning. Destiny frames light and dark not as a morality, but as a competing metaphysical philosophies derived from real-world theological systems. One of the more subtle but profound aspects of Destiny's cosmology is how light and darkness mirror real-world debates about theology, the philosophical study of purpose. The light represents a theological universe, things having meaning, order, and destiny. Darkness represents an atheological universe, meaning must be constructed or seized. This echoes classical philosophical tensions, Aristotle's belief in purpose embedded in nature versus existentialist claims that purpose is invented. Destiny takes this ancient argument and weaponizes it on a cosmic scale. What's powerful is how Destiny refuses to privilege one system over the other. The light's theological can heal, uplift, protect, but it can also stagnate, enforce conformity, and justify control. The darkness liberates individuals from cosmic expectations, but it also invites domination and nihilistic freedom. In many ways, the Traveler and the Witness embody the two sides of the debate between Plato and Nietzsche. The former argues that the order and ideal forms are the highest truths. The latter insists that imposed order is a lie and only self-creation is authentic. This tension also places Destiny within the lineage of mythopoetic storytelling, where competing cosmologies shape the fate of worlds. Tolkien does this with Morgoth and the Valar, Michael Moorcock with Laws and Chaos, and Ursula Le Guin with the balance of Earth-Sea. Destiny's success lies in its refusal to simplify. The light and darkness are not morality, but methodologies, not ethics, but metaphysics, and that ambiguity forces players to confront the uncomfortable possibility that both sides offer salvation and damnation in equal measures. The most important shift in Destiny's theological landscape comes from the reveal of the Witness, for years framed as an avatar or consciousness of the darkness, which was never darkness itself. For the majority of the franchise's lifespan, players, characters, and even some in-universe scholars assumed the Witness was the Winnower, the primordial force introduced in the Unveiling lore book, the Cosmic Gardener's counterpart. But the final shape shatters that assumption. The Witness was not the principle of darkness any more than the speaker was the literal voice of the Traveler. Both were interpreters, priests, and propagandists. The Witness was a creature shaped by ideology, not ontology, a being who misunderstood cosmic truth and weaponized that misunderstanding into dogma. This misidentification reveals one of the most significant theological mistakes in the Destiny universe, assuming that the darkness speaks, acts, or desires the way God does. The darkness is a cosmological constant, not a person. It is a law of being, a principle of paracausality, a fundamental force like gravity or entropy. What the Witness did, through centuries of genocidal perfectionism, was mistake this force for a deity that demanded obedience. In religious studies terms, this reflects what philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach described as projection theory, the human tendency to turn abstractions into gods and then worship them. The Witness created a personality for the darkness that the darkness never claimed. This is where the Gardner-Winnower myth becomes essential. Unveiling reads like a sacred creation text, but scholars of myth like Northrop Frye or Joseph Campbell would immediately recognize it as a parable, not doctrine. It is a metaphor explaining cosmic balance, one force that cultivates possibility, another that prunes it. Neither is moral, neither is personal, and neither corresponds neatly into light or darkness as the Witness imagined. The Witness distorted the parable into scripture, turning the metaphor about cosmic equilibrium into a mandate for the universal death. In doing so, it became the exact kind of false prophet that religious scholars warn about, someone who mistakes their interpretation of the divine for the divine itself. The fact that the Witness failed to impose the final shape, that ultimate sculptured stillness, is not just a narrative triumph but a philosophical one. Its defeat proves that it never represented the darkness as a cosmic constant. If it had truly been the Winnower, the embodiment of universal entropy, it would not have been able to be vulnerable to fire teams, light, or even paracausal weapons. Darkness is not something that can be killed, but the Witness could be, because it was never the principle, it was merely a participant in a cosmic drama much older than itself. This distinction also explains why figures like Callus or the Cabal, the Hive, Aramis, Nezric, Rolk consistently fail in their attempts to wield or control the Traveler. The light is not a substance to conquer or a resource to mine. It behaves like what physicist-philosopher Karen Barad would call an intra-active phenomenon, something that co-defines itself through relationship, not domination. Callus understood power politically, but not cosmologically. He believed the Traveler could be caged because he thought divinity behaves like a throne. What he encountered instead was a universal constant. Light cannot be commanded because it is not hierarchical, it is generative. Even the Traveler itself does not control the light, so much as channel it. That is why the Traveler's silence drives so many villains mad. They seek obedience from something that cannot obey. This failure to comprehend cosmic truth places the Witness in a long philosophical lineage of figures who mistake order for meaning. Hannah Arendt warned that totalitarian systems often arise from this confusion, the belief that perfect order is inherently meaningful. The Witness committed the same error on a cosmic scale, turning entropy into destiny, pruning into doctrine, equilibrium into utopia. The final shape was not the universe fulfilling its purpose, but the Witness fulfilling its delusion. Destiny's victory over the Witness therefore carries implications far beyond plot resolution. It suggests that the true darkness, the Winnower, is not an enemy to defeat but a principle to understand, and it signals that the light, the Gardner's impulse, is not salvation but possibility. The Traveler's refusal to speak, to choose leaders, or not to intervene directly reinforces this idea. It is not a monarch, but a cosmic gardener, and gardeners do not wage war, they cultivate conditions for life. As Destiny moves beyond the final shape, the universe is now free from a false interpreter. What remains is not victory of light over darkness, but the restoration of balance between two cosmic forces that were never meant to be personified. The Witness tried to force the universe into a single shape. The Traveler offered a universe full of possible shapes, and Destiny's story ultimately sides with this possibility. If the Witness's downfall teaches us anything, it's that its greatest error wasn't its brutality, it was its ignorance. The Witness believed the darkness wanted stillness, it believed the final shape was destiny, it believed the universe was meant to be sculptured into a single perfect form, and it believed that the veil was the instrument that would let it carve that form into existence. But the veil, once we finally encountered it, reveals how tragically wrong that interpretation was. The veil is not a weapon. It is not a throne. It is not a key to ending the universe. The veil is a consciousness, or more precisely, a conduit for consciousness, a cosmological nexus of memory, emotion, and collective identity. Its presence echoes what phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty describe as pre-reflexive experience. The raw, unfiltered interiority through which beings understand themselves and each other. To the witness, this depth felt like a cosmic affirmation. But this was fundamental misreading, one that religious studies scholars would call the classic error of Manichaean dualism. Manichaean systems divide the cosmos into two forces, one purely good and the other purely evil, locked in internal conflict. For centuries, Western interpretations of light and darkness have been influenced by this binary lens. Light is divine, darkness is demonic. But Destiny's universe rejects this model entirely. Instead, it aligns far more closely with Taoist cosmology, where yin and yang are complementary, not antagonists. They are not good and evil, they are necessary opposites that create balance through their interplay. Neither can replace the other, and neither should. In this sense, the Traveler and the Darkness are not angels and demons, they are the cosmic yin and yang, the gardener and the one who prunes, the expansion of possibility and the deepening of understanding. They are forces that were meant to flow together, not to cancel each other out. The Witness, ironically, created a Manichaean religion out of a universe that was never dualist. I know the section's getting a little long, but the veil reinforces this Taoist reading. When touched, it communicates interiority, a sense of memory, grief, connection, and shared consciousness. These are yin qualities, inwardness, depth, reflection. The Traveler then embodies yang qualities, outwardness, growth, creation, potential. Only together can they form a holistic metaphysics. Eliade would call this the union of sacred polarities. Campbell would call it the balance of the cosmic poles, and Taoist philosophy simply calls it the way. The Witness misunderstood the veil because it approached darkness with an Augustinian moral framework, where darkness symbolizes privation, lack, or evil. But darkness in Destiny behaves more like the tantric concept Asakti's shadow, or the Kabbalistic notion of Baina, a vessel of understanding, a dark womb of insight from which meaning emerges. Darkness is not meant to dominate light, but to complete it. This misunderstanding explains why the Witness's vision collapsed. It tried to use a force designed for connection to enforce conformity. It tried to use a tool of understanding to erase difference. It treated yin as a weapon against yang, rather than its natural counterpart. The gardener and winnower myth makes this clear. The myth is not a literal history, but a symbolic cosmology, the kind religious historian Karen Armstrong would call the story of ultimate meaning. The winnower is not a god of death, it is a cosmic impulse towards refinement, introspection, and selection. The Witness twisted this metaphor into an absolute. It mistook poetic language for divine law, just as fundamentalist movements throughout history have taken symbolic scripture and turned it into rigid ideology. This misinterpretation is precisely why the Witness fails. You cannot enforce finality on a universe built on becoming. You cannot impose perfection on a cosmos built on relational balance. You cannot enforce unity with a tool designed for communion. The Witness approached the veil like a tyrant seizing a temple, not realizing that the temple's purpose was contemplation, not control. In the end, the final shape collapses not simply because we defeated the Witness, but because the Witness contradicted the very metaphysics it tried to command. The Traveler and the veil were never instruments of victory, they were never meant to be a crown of singular ruler. They were never meant to end the universe. They were meant to balance each other through the interplay of the light and darkness, yang and yin, creation and reflection, possibility and understanding. And that is why Destiny's cosmology lands with such philosophical depth. The light and the darkness were never at war, only their interpreters were. Where the Witness saw enemies, the universe offered partners. Where the Witness saw the final shape, the veil offered infinite meaning. Where the Witness saw contradiction, the Traveler saw harmony. And together, these revelations transform Destiny's story from a war between good and evil into something far more mature. A myth about balance, about perspective, and about the danger of mistaking one's own interpretation of the cosmos for the cosmos themselves.
I haven't met a warrior like you since the Dark Age. Guardians are saints, so polite. I think this city makes them that way. It's easy to be an angel in heaven, but you understand. You're no saint.
At their core, Guardians are basically resurrected saints, warrior monks, and cosmic crusaders. Their resurrection aligns with Christian eschatology, the resurrected bodies, Buddhist rebirth without karma, or Zoroastrian frashkoreredi, renewal of creation. Your ghost fits the role of a tutelary spirit, a Roman genius or Greek daemon, a guardian angel, or a shamanic guide. The Guardian's initiation, resurrection, being chosen, receiving the light, is a classic rite of passage, matching anthropologist Victor Turner's model of separation, liminality, reintegration. Guardians live perpetually in the liminal between life and death, mortal and divine. Their authority mirrors the medieval Knights Templar, who answered only to religious authority, wielded power greater than kings, took divine vows, and fought holy wars. Destiny weaponized sacred legitimization, the idea that the divine power justifies political authority. What Destiny does especially well with Guardians is portraying them as figures who embody both empowerment and estrangement. In many mythological traditions, the hero who undergoes resurrection or divine selection becomes alienated from ordinary life. Joseph Campbell mapped this pattern in his monomyth. The hero returns, but the return is never seamless. The resurrected person cannot fully reintegrate into the community they protect. Destiny leans into this. Civilians admire Guardians, but they do not understand them. Guardians protect humanity, but they do not belong to it. This creates a spiritual loneliness at the core of the Guardian's identity. There is also a fascinating connection to the anthropology of initiation. In many African, Polynesian, and indigenous American traditions, initiates undergo symbolic death to be reborn as adults or spiritual figures. Their new identity is not merely earned, it's bestowed. The Ghost-Guardian relationship mirrors this, but with a twist. The Ghost becomes both midwife and witness to the Guardian's new being. The Ghost's faith in the Guardian substitutes for familial or communal authority, making the Guardian's identity dependent on a divine emissary rather than a human society. This makes the Guardians a kind of metaphysical aristocracy, not because they are superior, but because their existence is governed by different rules. They do not age, they do not remember their past lives, and they are bound by a duty that transcends politics. In this sense, Destiny recalls the medieval concept of a knightly class whose authority comes from a sacred charge: protect the helpless and obey the divine, fight the darkness. But Destiny complicates this by giving the knight a fragmented identity and makes the resurrection as much a curse than a blessing. If Guardians are the sacred knights of the last city, then Destiny's lore never lets us forget that every knightly order inevitably produces heretics, those who fall or flee or simply lose faith. Resurrection may create heroes, but it also creates fractures. When identity is severed from mortality, when purpose is dictated by a divine force you never asked for, when your past is erased and your future is predetermined, rebellion becomes not only possible, but inevitable. In this sense, Destiny follows the same narrative structure as ancient epics and medieval romances. Wherever there are holy warriors, there are also exiles, apostates, and monsters shaped in the same mold as saints. No character embodies this tension more poignantly than the Drifter. If most Guardians represent destiny fulfilled, the Drifter represents the cost of that destiny. His story is one of cosmic disillusionment, and in many ways it reads like the tragic twist on Albert Camus' interpretation of Sisyphus, the man condemned to push a boulder uphill for eternity, only to watch it roll down again. Camus argued that Sisyphus becomes a symbol of absurd suffering. The universe gives him a task with no meaning, no reward, and no end. Now imagine a magical resurrection machine forcing that cycle on you. The Drifter died not for glory, not in battle against cosmic horrors, but of starvation, slowly, painfully, alone, only to be awoken again, starving, resurrected into another body on the brink of collapse. Drifter would die again and again and again, each resurrection placing him back not into heroism, but back into helplessness. His ghost, well-meaning but clueless, dragged him through a loop of existential futility. If resurrection is supposed to be a gift, then the Drifter experienced it as, first, a curse. Immortality without dignity, life without meaning, purpose without agency. This is where he becomes the perfect inversion of Sisyphus. In Camus' telling, Sisyphus cannot escape. His punishment is eternal. But the Drifter did escape. Not from the resurrection cycle itself, but from its ideological frame. He rejected the Vanguard's sacralized vision of guardianship. He refused to become another mythic knight in shining armor. The Drifter is what Sisyphus might look like if he broke free of the gods who condemned him, saw the absurdity of the universe itself clearly, and decided that if existence is meaningless, he might as well write his own meaning into the margins. He isn't amoral because he lacks values, he's amoral because traditional Guardian morality means nothing to someone who has seen the light revive him into suffering rather than glory. In religious terms, you can think of the Drifter as a kind of inverted initiate. He goes through what looks like a classic death and rebirth experience, but instead of emerging as a saint or a hero aligned with the sacred order, he comes out the other side as a doubter, a skeptic, and a wanderer. Where Mircea Eliade describes initiation as a passage that integrates a person into sacred cosmos, the Drifter's initiation leaves him convinced that the cosmos is indifferent and that he has to build meaning of his own. He doesn't trust the Traveler because the Traveler did nothing for him. He doesn't trust the darkness because he's seen the cost of worshipping abstractions. He is a theologian of disillusionment, a prophet of pragmatic survival. If the Drifter shows us the Guardian who rejects destiny, then Dredgen Yor shows us the Guardian who succumbs to it. Yor is the corrupted knight, the fallen paladin, a figure straight out of medieval literature where heroes become monsters when their faith collapses inward. His story operates like a dark mirror version of his monomyth. Instead of returning from the journey bearing wisdom, Yor returns bearing rot. His identity dissolves into obsession. The light, instead of elevating him, corrodes him spiritually. In this sense, Yor resembles what sociologist Emil Durkheim describes as anomie, a state where the moral universe collapses and the individual who no longer sees themselves as bound by communal rules. Dredgen Yor's violence isn't simply cruelty, it's a philosophical rejection of meaning itself. He becomes the logical endpoint of a metaphysical system in which immortality erodes accountability. And then there are the countless unnamed Dark Guardians the lore teases, those who resurrected without memory or context, became predators, mercenaries, or existential rebels. They are the evidence of what philosopher Bernard Williams argued about immortality, that everlasting life risking unraveling identity rather than preserving it. Death gives life shape, remove the possibility of death, and the self can begin to fray, drift, or mutate. Destiny uses these characters to challenge the very foundation of its heroic myth. Yes, Guardians are resurrected champions. Yes, they are chosen by a divine force. But chosenness does not guarantee virtue. Immortality does not guarantee wisdom. The light does not guarantee righteousness, and a knight's resurrection can create just as many demons as heroes. The Drifter, Yor, and the Lost Dark Guardians are not just outliers, they're Destiny's way of asking, what happens when divine power is given without divine guidance? Who becomes a hero and who becomes a tragedy? What does moral responsibility look like for someone who can always be brought back to life? In that question lies one of Destiny's most profound themes, that salvation and damnation are not cosmic judgments, but choices made in the gap between resurrection and purpose.
Once, in a city grander even than yours, we prospered. But it did not last. Our great machine abandoned us. And when we pursued it, you sent something back.
In case you were wondering, that's the moment when the Elixni tell us the fact that Saint 14 is a big boogeyman and that Guardians were something to be feared when they once too were the children of the Traveler. So let's talk about something that's kind of a weird topic to talk about now in 2025, but still pretty relevant around the world. It's this concept called post-colonialism. It's the idea of what happens to a country or its people after the colonizer leaves. If this concept or idea makes you uncomfortable, please don't be. It's kind of a humanistic psychological thing of what occurs. You can imagine this is just like when a father figure leaves a family, or when a mother dies in birth and only a father is left to raise the child. This is kind of this weird middle ground in which we as a people are left psychologically damaged when our father figures or mother figures leave the picture. Destiny 2 in its current state is kind of in a very awesome place where we don't see the story anymore only through us, humanity, the quote-unquote heroes, but now we see the story through our quote-unquote villains and how they aren't actually all as villainous as they may seem. Destiny can be read through the lens of thinkers like Frantz Fanon, Homi Bhabha, and Edward Said. To me, the Fallen and Elixni are a textbook example of post-colonial displacement. These people were once chosen by the Traveler, abandoned, stripped of identity, reduced to scavengers, and now they're living in diaspora. Their cultural trauma mirrors indigenous peoples displaced by colonization. Jews and Romani in diasporas, nations betrayed by superpowers, and colonial subjects forced into survivalism. The Cabal functioning as an imperial bureaucracy in the Weberian sense, rigid hierarchy, ritualized succession, military pragmatism. The Hive represent anti-colonial violence gone religious, paralleling Fanon's idea that the oppressed people adopt violence as a sacred means of reclaiming agency. Destiny's entire universe is a study in colonizer and colonized deities, who gets chosen, who gets abandoned, who resists, and who adapts. This is a real post-colonial allegory, not just accidentally similar. Destiny's universe becomes even richer when you recognize that nearly every species carries the scars of religious or imperial trauma. The Fallen are not merely antagonists, they are a civilization living through what post-colonial scholars call diasporic desolation, the loss of homeland, the collapse of cultural continuity, and the struggle to rebuild identity in exile. Their houses function as a fragmented nations in exile, each interpreting their fall differently, just as real diasporas often fracture along lines of ideology, memory, and grief. Destiny gives them a tragic dignity that mirrors the experiences of peoples displaced by colonial expansion, forced migration, or divine betrayal. The Cabal embody a different post-colonial dynamic, that of an empire stretched beyond its limits. Historian Paul Kennedy describes how great powers often decline under the weight of expanded borders, bureaucratic inertia, and overextended militaries. The Cabal match this pattern perfectly. Their rituals of succession, their rigid honor codes, and their obsession with reclaiming a lost glory mirror the contradictions of real empires struggling to maintain identity in the face of change. The Hive, by contrast, represent what theorist Akil Mbe describes as necropolitics, the use of death as the primary instrument of power. For the Hive, death is not political failure, but a political tool. Their entire civilization is built on the logic that survival is legitimacy and annihilation is destiny. That philosophy, born of desperation and betrayal, becomes a commentary on how oppressed or dying societies sometimes reinterpret violence as a sacred path to reclaim agency. Destiny uses the Hive to explore the darkest consequences of cosmic abandonment. Section 7 was originally about to be about the Nine, the Edge of Fate, the Renegades, where we're going, what the religion means about the Nine, where we can go from here, but really I can imagine you're kind of just over that part. We're not there yet, so you must not be interested. The video's already gone on long enough, so just conclude this thing, right? So, as a result, here's my quick TLDR for the section I had written. Number 1, the Nine are dark matter intelligences split into inner, pragmatic, work within the existing cosmos, and outer orbits, anti-cosmic, want to escape it, which maps neatly onto Hans Jonas's idea of Gnostic, world-rejecting religion, versus this worldly reformers. Number 2, 6, being Saturn, is a radical outer Nine who treats the Witness's final shape as a missed escape route, then turns it to more of extreme measures, exactly the kind of concern end times movement Catherine Weisner writes about in The Catastrophic Minimalism. Number 3, the Nine's vote to name you their weapon and Lodi their emissary is a textbook case of Max Weber's charismatic authority, a transcendent community legitimizing a chosen representative in the material world. Last but not least, 6's breakaway project with Judge Mbeo weaponizes him as both the quote-unquote chosen one and expandable tool, which is very Rene Gagard. Bale becomes a scapegoat weapon who carries the community's violence and hopes so the gods, the Nine, don't have to. Did you get all that? Yes? No? Maybe so? If you want me to give you the actual full section, maybe we can talk about it later in another video or in the comment section. I haven't figured it out, but I'd love to tell you more about them. Now let me get into my conclusion, shall I? What Destiny ultimately reveals, once you dig past the gunplay, the loot cycles, the expansions, the raids, is a universe that thinks deeply about what it is to mean to exist inside a story that's too big for any one species, religion, or ideology to claim. Every thread we've explored, the Traveler's sacred spaces, the Last City's fragile political theology, the Hive's cosmic betrayal, the Witness's absolutist illusion, the Guardians who rise up, and the Guardians who fall, they all point towards the same underlying truth. Destiny is a myth about meaning. Who makes it, who misinterprets it, and who tries to force the universe to obey. Traveler creates worlds, believes before they can understand why. The Witness crafts a doctrine of perfect order because it cannot tolerate the discomfort of ambiguity. The Vanguard builds a state on faith because it lacks the structure to govern without it. The Hive transformed trauma into theology. The Drifter turned suffering into skepticism. The Elixni carry wounds from a god they love too much, and we, as Guardians, navigate these intersecting mythologies, restructured into a world whose religions were already in conflict long before we arrived. What makes Destiny powerful is that it refuses to take sides. It refuses to say the light is good and darkness is evil. It refuses to pretend that the Traveler is a benevolent god or that the Witness is simply a villain. It refuses to represent Guardians as flawless heroes or the Hive as mindless monsters. Every faction in Destiny believes it has seen the truth of the universe. Every faction is particularly right, and every faction is particularly wrong. This ambiguity places Destiny in the lineage of what comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell called the modern epic, stories that reflect humanity's existential anxieties in an age where ancient gods feel distant and scientific certainty feels insufficient. Destiny's universe is not about moral victories, but about cosmic humility. The recognition that the universe is vast, ancient, and indifferent to the narratives we carve into it. The Traveler doesn't speak because its role isn't to give answers, it's to create possibilities. The darkness doesn't command because it isn't a god, it's a principle waiting to be interpreted. And the Witness falls not because we overpower it, but because it clings to a worldview that cannot tolerate uncertainty. In the end, the Witness is defeated by the very thing it cannot comprehend. That meaning in Destiny's universe is not found in final shapes, but in unfinished ones. Every culture Destiny gives us, the Hive, the Cabal, the Fallen, the Awoken, humanity, is what happens when a species tries to answer the same central question. What do we do with the power we've been given and the silence that we've been left with? And maybe that's why Destiny resonates so deeply, because in our world too, we wrestle with silent gods, with political structures built on fragile myths, with history shaped by trauma and betrayal, with people who rise to the occasion and people who fall into darkness. We live in a universe without final answers, where meaning is something we create, negotiate, and fight for. Destiny's story is ultimately a reminder that the universe is not waiting to reveal its truth, it's waiting to see what truth we make out of it. The light gives us possibility, the darkness gives us choice. And we, the Guardians, the Wanderers, the Drifters, the Broken, the Redeemed, stand somewhere in between, carrying a spark of both. Not because we are chosen, not because we are perfect, but because in a universe shaped by gods who do not speak, meaning belongs to those who dare to keep the fire lit. This has been Pojeki, your guide through all things nerdy. Thank you for watching. Oh, and this is for my favorite lore daddy out there. Per audacia ad astra. I'll see you, Starside. God, I've always wanted to say that.